Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Community Book Center's kickoff of our 39th
Absolutely.
anniversary celebration. We are very honored and pleased to be at the Stella Jones Gallery, where Shauna Jones Edwards is launching her first book in cooperation with her co-author, Allison Richard. The book, The Thread Collectors, is a collaboration such as this evening's event, a collaboration between Community Book Center and the Stella Jones Gallery. Community Book Center over the years has had the honor to work with many organizations and groups. And it is in that spirit of cooperation and collaboration that we have been able to survive and maneuver in these economic times through cooperation and collaboration. The book also is a story of working together, collaborating, and of course, with cooperation. It's a historical fiction, and it has a lot of New Orleans and a lot of history included in it. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce to you the co-author, Shauna Edwards, and she will give you all of the inside story. Well, not all of it, because you have to buy the book. She'll give you a little peek inside of the thread collectors. We appreciate your continued support, and we hope you enjoy this evening's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vera. And I know you guys are going to be captivated by this book. So before I let you go, remind me of your website. It's readcbc.com.
Readcbc.com.
All right, and you can buy the thread collectors there. You may also hear a small baby at times, and that is because that is my nephew, Corbin, and this is a gallery. This is a family gallery that's been in my family. And my mother, Stella Jones, she may get grabbed up here. And we welcome our family and we want our little ones to read as early as possible. So I do not want Corbin to go anywhere because I want him to hear about this book.
Thank you.
So in the thread collectors, you're going to meet two couples. It's a Black couple and it's a Jewish couple, and their fates intertwine in the Civil War. It opens in 1863 in New Orleans, and you're seeing our heroine, Stella, named after my mother. She is saying goodbye to her beloved. Her beloved is William. He is a gifted musician. We know that the history of music runs deep in New Orleans. It runs deep in the African American community. It runs deep in the South. And he flees to join the Union Army, and he meets on the battlefield right outside of New Orleans a gifted Jewish musician named Jacob Klein. And it's the friendship between these two men on the battlefields, including at the Battle of Port Hudson, which took place just about an hour and a half away from New Orleans, where we're sitting right now, that allows you to see how these two couples' fates intertwine. We have the women of New Orleans, Stella, her sister Amine, her mother Janie, trying to figure out how they're going to survive in Union-occupied New Orleans. We have Jacob's wife, who is a Jewish abolitionist living up in New York, and she's trying to figure out how she's going to help the Union cause as well. And everyone is doing, to Vera's point, what they can. So Stella decides she's a gifted embroiderist. She is going to start making covert masks out of collected thread to help enslaved men run away to the Union Army. And at the same time, Lily, she'd rather be making speeches and writing pamphlets, but she's using her needle and thread to create quilts that are sold for the Union Army cause because that's what's available to her, a woman of her class at the time. So both of these women using their needles and thread, both of these men, gifted musicians trying to survive the horrors of the Civil War. Allison and I started talking about this book in 2017, if you can believe it. At the time, she's an established author. This is her 8th novel, I believe. She always has different ideas in her head, and we've been friends for over a decade. And so she was talking to me about this idea. She had just seen a documentary called Death in the Civil War. And unbeknownst to her, but it's something that I've known, growing up in a house where Black history was taught, Black soldiers that joined the Union Army, and there were 180,000 of them, they didn't get to fight, right? They were basically forced to do manual labor, the same kind of manual labor that they were fighting to be freed from. And one of the more sad jobs that they had is they had to bury white soldiers. The war was moving so quickly, people were basically being buried where they fell. At the same time, you had friends on the battlefield, they would make these little maps and they would take them back to people's widows and family with the attempts that hopefully they could find their beloved ones' remains, because it wasn't until the end of the Civil War that there started to be a register kept of soldiers and who died. We didn't even have ambulances back then. All of these things were innovations that we made in the Civil War because the death toll was so high. So she had been thinking about this idea, maybe there's a Black soldier and a white soldier, a Jewish soldier, since she's Jewish and proud of her heritage, and they meet on the battlefield, and then the Black soldier makes a map and he brings it, and then that way the Jewish widow can find her husband's remains. Well, I reject a story where you introduce a Black character and they don't have their own life and they don't have their own backstory. Black people shouldn't be used just to move the plot forward. And so I said to her, what if he has a beloved and she takes the map? He's not going to be able to read or write. She takes the map and she creates something tangible, something that will last until he's able to use it to reunite his family. And she was like, I love that because it opens up a love story. And I hadn't thought about a love story. I just thought friendship between these men. But we didn't write the book at that time. Both she and then she called me in 2020. And this was after the murder of George Floyd. I was working full-time in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it was a very difficult time for the entire nation, and certainly a difficult time for me. And she asked me if I wanted to write this book with her. And my first thought was no. You know, I say this very plainly to her, is like, your white girl of the most period of racial strife. It takes a pretty brave person to do that. And I didn't know if I was going to be that brave. But after speaking about it with my now husband and people in my life, I decided I'll give it a try. But I said to her, and our first real writing day was on Juneteenth, I said, I will only write this book with you if we can be completely honest. I want to know about your heritage as a Jewish woman. I want you to listen to my perspective as a Black woman. And most importantly, we have to be able to say the hard words to each other. And she looked at me and she said, well, this book is really important to me because I didn't mention it, but in her family, she has two great uncles. They fought on opposite sides of the Civil War. So she has a Jewish ancestor that literally took up arms to keep slavery in play because he was concerned about his economic future. He'd only been in the country for about 12 years. He had moved to Satarsha, Mississippi, and he was worried that he would lose everything. So he took up arms on behalf of Confederacy. And she said, this is really important for me to get out there. I want to tell his story. And she said, don't worry, I've been raised to be colorblind. And I said that I won't write this book with you. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, if you cannot see my color and you cannot understand the importance of my identity, then we don't have anything to put on the page. Amen. And so that was the level of honesty about the conversations that we had. It's also the level of honesty we had to have with our editors at times. You know, we really deep into some historical episodes that I hadn't known about. Like, we used a lot of the historical New Orleans collection. I relied greatly on the help of the Amistad, the Schomburg up in New York, and she also relied on the Chappelle Foundation, which tracks the lives of Jewish Civil War soldiers. There were only 8,000 of them. And here are some of the instances of history that we learned that I had not known about. As I mentioned, some of the action takes place on the battlefields of Port Hudson. That's an hour and a half from here. I had watched the movie Glory. My brother's in the audience. That's one of his favorite movies. And I had always thought that that was the first time that Black men had been allowed to fight. I found out through research that the Battle of Port Hudson happened at least 3 or 4 weeks before that. And I know you might say 3 or 4 weeks, but with the amount of battles that were happening in the Civil War and the death toll, that was essentially a lifetime before. And the tragedy of Port Hudson is that while they allowed the black men to fight, the Union officers, they were either too incompetent or too callous to do appropriate reconnaissance. So they sent hundreds of black soldiers into a blind shooting alley. The Confederates held the bluff overhead, and hundreds of them were mowed down, and their bodies laid there for over a month before they were buried. That's something that I hadn't known, in spite of the fact that, I'm the daughter of Stella Jones, who like reads Black history. In New York, where I now live, on the corner of 43rd Street and Fifth Avenue, there used to be a colored children's asylum. I'm using the word colored because that was in the name. And their parents, their fathers were fighting for the Union Army, and they burned them out of the orphanage. July in 1863, miraculously, all 233 of these black children escaped. They escaped out of a side door, and one of the girls, she was about 9 years old, she grabbed a Bible on the way and she said, "God will save us." And today that Bible is held in the New York Historical Society. Well, I'm a member of the Harvard Club, which is a block away from there. That's an empty pit right now. They're putting up another, tower. There's no plaque there. There's nothing that I would have known. I certainly knew about the draft riots, but there's nothing that I would have known that said something that I pass by almost weekly. 1,000 people tried to burn 230 black children to death in their beds. And there were things about Allison's heritage I didn't know. For instance, I didn't know that the Union Army actually expelled all Jewish soldiers at one point. They expelled them because they thought that Jewish merchants were cheating the federal government. And so they said, basically, you're not Americans, you're traitors, we want you all out. So we just kept uncovering things, and we said, well, we're both two educated women. We're interested in history, we're interested in our cultures, and the fact that we don't know these things means that it has to be on the page. So we use the intertwining stories of the black couple, Stella and William, and the Jewish couple, Jacob and Lily, to talk about all of these human emotions that people go through when times are really divided, but also to put things to the forefront, I think with the hope that we don't necessarily have to experience them again. So there's a little bit of everything in this book. I think in the very best possible way. There is a love story because both of these couples are very much in love, even though they are separated. There is friendship. There's friendship between the men on the battlefield and what they go through. There is creativity and purpose. They both really bond over their love of music, and Stella really finds purpose in terms of making these maps. There's familial relationships. There's strife between the two Jewish brothers, one who's fighting for the Union Army, one who's fighting for the Confederate Army. Stella has a half sister who's essentially in bondage in her house. There's just a lot going on, and at times I thought, how are we going to knit all of this together? But what I realized is during times of war, during times of trouble, life still goes on. So you have all of the higher issues, and then you have all of the domestic issues and whether or not you're going to get along with your sister. And so we really did put all of that together. We have fallen in love with this book. We really have put our family's history on the page. We have put our passion and purpose on the page. It does not end in a nice, neat little bow. We deliberately ended it before the end of the Civil War because in my mind, I know where these characters go. I don't think enough has been written about Reconstruction. So I would love to talk about the failed promises of Reconstruction. I would love to explore the Harlem Renaissance. I'm obviously from a family that loves art, so there's a lot to be said there. And I could see us wrapping up during the Civil Rights era. So that's the background of the book. If you guys will indulge me, I thought that I might read the first two chapters. So the Thread Collectors. It starts with the Gullah Geechee proverb because the main black hero, William, while he thrives in New Orleans, he's originally from Sapelo Island. If you don't know where you're going, you should know where you come from. Gullah Geechee proverb. Part 1, Chapter 1. New Orleans, Louisiana, March 1863. She opens the door to the Creole cottage just wide enough to ensure it is truly him. Outside, the pale moon is high in the sky, illuminating only half of William's face. Stella reaches for her sleeve and pulls him inside. He is dressed to run. He wears his good clothes, but has chosen his attire thoughtfully, ensuring the colors will camouflage in the wilderness that immediately surrounds the city. In his hand, he clasps a brown canvas case. They've only spoken in whispers during their clandestine meetings about his desire to fight, to flee. The city of New Orleans teeters on the precipice of chaos, barely contained by the Union forces occupying the streets. Homes abandoned, businesses boarded up. Stella's master comes back from the front every 6 weeks, each time seeming more battered, bitter, and restless than the last. William sets down his bag and draws Stella close into his chest, his heartbeat accelerating. He lifts a single slim finger, slowly tracing the contours of her face, trying to memorize her one last time. You stay here no matter what, he murmurs into her ear. You must keep safe, and for a woman like you, better to hide and stay unseen than venture out there. In the shadow, he sees her eyes shimmer, but she balances the tears from falling, an art she had been taught long ago, when she learned that survival, not happiness, was the real prize. Stella slips momentarily from William's arms. She tiptoes towards a small wooden chest. From the top drawer, she retrieves a delicate handkerchief with a single violet embroidered mid-center. With materials in the city now so scarce, she has had to use the dark blue thread from her skirt's hem to stitch the tiny flower on a swatch of white cotton cut from her petticoat. So you know you're never alone out there, she says as she closes William's fingers around the kerchief. He has brought something for her too, a small speckled cowrie shell that he slips from a worn indigo-colored pouch. The shell and its cotton purse are his two most sacred possessions in the world. He puts the pouch, now empty, back into his pocket. I'll be coming back for that, Stella. William smiles as he looks down at the talisman in his beloved's hand. And for you too. Everything will be different soon. She nods, takes the shell, and feels its smooth lip against her palm. There was a time such cowries were used as a form of currency for their people. Shells threaded on pieces of string exchanged for precious goods. Now the shell is both worthless and priceless as it's exchanged for safekeeping between the lovers. There's no clock in her small home. William, too, wears no watch, yet both of them know they've already tarried too long. He must set out before there's even a trace of sunlight, and even then his journey will be fraught with danger. Go, William, she says, pushing him out the door. Her heart breaks knowing the only protection she can offer him is a single handkerchief, her love stitched into it by her hand. He leaves as stealthily as he arrived, a whisper in the night. Stella falls back into the shadows of her cottage. She treads silently towards her bedroom, hoping to wrap herself tightly in the folds of the quilt that bring her so much comfort. You all right? A soft sound emerges in the dark. Amine? Stella's voice breaks as she says the woman's name. Yes, I'm here. Amine enters the room, her face brightened by a small wax candle in her grip. In the golden light, she sits down on the bed and reaches for Stella's hand, still clutching the tiny shell, which leaves a deep imprint in her palm. Really strong, Amine says over and over again. You're gonna make it, I know. Stella doesn't answer. A flicker of pain stabs her from the inside, and she finally allows her tears to run. Chapter 2, Camp Parapet, Jefferson, Louisiana. The 10 miles journey from New Orleans to the army camp that was perched between Lake Pontchartrain and the river had been treacherous and lengthy. William avoided all roads at any cost, regardless of whether they were dirt or paved. He didn't know when his mask would discover that he had fled, but he was all too aware of the slave catchers camped right outside the city. Any man they captured would suffer greatly, lashings that ripped the skin off their back, fleur-de-lis brands marking the bearer as untrustworthy, and for those with particularly brutal masters, with enough slaves to spare, bodies doused with kerosene and lit on fire, their burning flesh a reminder to the others on the plantation that it was never worth it to run. He took the route that Stella had advised, first through the swampland, then hugging the bayous and creeping through boggy marshes and wetlands that had to be navigated to reach higher ground. The roots of bald cypress trees and tupelo guns intertwined between the murky water of the ravines, causing William to stumble countless times. He'd nearly been caught 3 times since he'd left Stella, but he kept running, hearing her voice in his head urging him on. He was driven by his mother's spirit toward each stretched toward freedom, defying those who robbed her of her song. and the hour right before dawn, the sound of barking dogs was dangerously close. He threw himself into the fetid waters, hoping to evade the bloodhounds, shivering until the patrollers finally moved away. He reached the enlistment camp by daybreak, where he found hundreds of men already in line, eager to join the Union cause. Some had traveled for days through back alleys or the more dangerous open fields. Like William, all of them had to evade mercenaries eager to beat and shackle them before returning them to their masters for a rich reward. The man in front of William stood barefoot, the cuffs of his pants reduced to a ragged edge of fringe. Fingers balled at his sides, he inched up the snaking line of the medical surgeon's tent, leaving a stamp of blood with each step. The dry earth, greedy for every ounce of moisture, drank the man's dark footprint almost instantly, only to have it replaced with another. Next! Outside the mouth of the tent's entrance, one of the Union soldiers waved another man inside. William looked down at his own narrow feet. The pair of waterlogged and sweat-stained calfskin Oxfords he had on were not the typical shoes of a contraband man running from slavery. His herringbone trousers had a gash down the side, his tweed jacket was ripped at the elbow, and somewhere between New Orleans and Jefferson Parish he had lost his hat. Yet despite his harrowing journey, his shoes remained miraculously intact. Inside his jacket, tucked it within the pockets of his waistcoat, he located the handkerchief Stella had embroidered. He surreptitiously ran his fingers over the small flower she'd stitched carefully with blue thread. Even now, with the stench of rot and death heavy in the air, the buzzing of flies and the intense hunger at his belly, thoughts of Stella were his constant companion. He brought the white cotton cloth to his nose and inhaled it, desperately searching for the last traces of her distinct scent. William knew breath was not something that always came from the lungs, but could break forth from the heart and mind as well, filling a body with life when it needed it most. In the corner of the tent, where William was told to undress, Jacob Kling sat bent over a thick ledger. Dark curls sprouted from beneath his navy cap, and a smudge of black ink stained his index finger as he recorded the medical surgeon's clinical observations about the prior recruit. 22 years old, Negro, 5'9", weight 175 pounds. Despite superficial wound to left foot, a solid build and determined spirit, qualified for military duty. The medical surgeon chose his words carefully when Jacob first arrived at the examination tent to assist with the note-taking. It's a sorry situation. We can't accept every man who wants to join up, despite the lengths they may have taken to get here, he explained as he opened his black leather physician's bag and arranged his tools on a side table. The Army asked me to separate out the strong from the weak. I have given up trying to determine whether a man is a fugitive, the doctor remarked, noting the futility of dividing the recently emancipated from those who had fled from bondage. Remember, these men will not be lifting muskets, but rather wielding shovels, pickaxes, and hoes. We can only take the ones who are free from bodily defects and have sufficient sense to follow orders. He cleared his throat and pulled at his ash-colored beard. In other words, Private Kling, my job is rather straightforward. It is not to choose who is in every way good, but to reject who is positively unfit. The doctor always began an examination with each candidate's head, ears, and eyes, and then continued on to inspect their teeth, neck, and chest. He also checked their hands and feet over carefully. Earlier that morning, a young man had taken off his shirt, and both Jacob and the doctor had found it impossible to keep their composure when they saw a thick blanket of scar tissue covering the man's back. The man tried to bring his hands above his head, but the painful scars limited his range of motion. His arms only lifted halfway, his hands barely lifting the level of his ears. Now, as William entered the tent, the doctor readjusted his focus. His eyes fell on William's shoes and his once elegant but now damaged clothes. Don't just stand there. Get undressed so I can examine you. William put down his satchel, removed his jacket, and slowly began to unbutton his vest and shirt. He knew he was far slighter than nearly every other man in line that afternoon. Having never worked a field, his body had not obtained the thick ropes of muscles his fellow slaves had developed. Instead, when he had been 6 years old, he'd been plucked from his mama's pallet and delivered to the big house to amuse the master's wife with his nascent talent. The doctor placed a stethoscope upon William's chest. Heart and lungs clear, the doctor said. Slight build, fit for service. He turned over William's palms. How oddly free of calluses, he muttered underneath his breath. Any skills? Musician, sir, William answered quietly, but the doctor was no longer listening.
Amen. Amen. Beautiful. Well done.
So I don't know if anyone has any questions, but I'm happy to take any that might be there. If not, no questions?
So yeah, I have one.
Yes.
So when you guys co-authored, and I feel really strongly the influence of your understanding of history.
Mm-hmm.
When you co-author with someone who's writing about a different culture, does she write the chapters on Jewish culture?
So
How does that work?
there are collaborations that are done that way, but we agreed from the beginning we wanted this to be a learning process for both of us. We didn't divide up the Black and Jewish cultures, right? We would work on the weekends, and I have a day job on the weekend. This is her full-time job. On the weekends, we would decide what was going to happen in the chapters to the characters. She might take a first really broad pass, and then I would go through at nights and on weekends, and I would fill in dialogue. We would talk about it, and every weekend we would kind of like constantly re-edit. So we learned about each other's cultures. By, I would say, midway through the book, we felt confident to suggest things that might come from other people's culture. Like there's a Passover dinner in here. The Kaddish is said, which is the Jewish prayer of death. And it was my thought, actually. I was like, maybe we should incorporate the Kaddish here. So we were constantly reading about each other's experiences and teaching each other. And literally every word in this book, we can both confidently say we wrote it because we constantly edited it together. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about your editing process? Were there certain scenes that you really fought tooth and nail to keep? Were there some that you guys disagreed about whether it should stay or go, or characters?
Yes and yes. That's a great question. So it's wonderful to write this with an established author who understands the publishing industry, because the publishing industry, like everything else, is a business. As I mentioned, and I love this cover, I fell in love with it. But for me, what had been the central point of entry into the story was the friendship between the men. I had always envisioned a cover that maybe had two musicians or people, like, because for me, that was the way that the couples came together. But mostly women by historical fiction, right? So your publisher is going to say, you got to put something on here that appeals to women. Relatively early in the book, there are a couple of scenes that are pretty real about what slavery was and the impact it had on families. And while I don't want to say my editor, who was wonderful, suggested that we take them out, she suggested altering the placement of them so people would fall in love with a little bit of the love story of the characters before you put history in their face. There were some times that we acquiesced and we actually thought she was right. There were some times we did not. There is a young character in this book. His name is Teddy. He is a young drummer boy. You learn about his story. He's also from New Orleans. And this is a character that at first our editorial team was skeptical as to whether we needed. But I really wanted to find a way to talk about like the disrupted innocence of Black children and young Black boys. And so for me, I fought very, very hard to keep Teddy in. Our early readers have said that Teddy is, one of their favorite characters. I think when you're going to embark upon a project like this, where you're going to take two marginalized perspectives and a time period that, let's be honest, we were recently on a radio station in Tennessee, and the guy said, I don't know if our libraries are going to carry your book, with CRT. If you're going to go there and you're going to do it, then you just fight for what you really want. And then there are also some times when we had conversations amongst each other. There's a scene that takes place fairly late in the book on the streets of New Orleans, and a young Black girl, probably about the age of 6 or 7, gives directions to someone that turn out to be really critical directions. And the way Allison, who took the first pass of that scene, originally wrote the scene, the person who's receiving the directions is surprised that the young girl knew her way. And I said, well, why is it surprising that a young Black girl would know her way around her neighborhood? Is she not intelligent? Is she not observant? She's not savvy? And I said, you also have to remember, this young girl has probably been working for years. And she's like, I didn't think about that. I was just thinking about a child, a 6-year-old. And I said, your 6-year-olds are not our 6-year-olds, right? Like, it's a completely different growth process sometimes because it has to be that way. The one other thing that happened from an editorial perspective, which I found interesting, was about the use of language. And when you're writing historical fiction, do you have to use language that people are more comfortable with now? I would be upfront and say there is the use of the N-word in this book. It is judicious, it's not gratuitous. But we had to discuss that with our editor, right? Like whether or not we should use it. And she thought perhaps we shouldn't. I sent her back, those of you who know me know this is how I deal with things. I sent her back a clipping from the New York Times contemporaneously using the word. And I said, if it was good enough for the New York Times in 1863, then it's good enough for me. And so I don't think we were here to whitewash history. And I'm not going to pretend that if a mob is chasing someone down the street in 1863, they're saying, get that colored man. That is not what they were saying. And I think that there were times when we had to have those uncomfortable conversations, but we knew we were going to fight for it. Are there any other questions? Yes, yeah.
I guess that was came up. That was my cynical question would be, do you think it would get better libraries now, particularly in Louisiana and Texas?
No. No. I don't think it'll be in libraries because I think it is a book made to make you think. You know, I certainly thought about how I had been viewing the Civil War only through a black and white prism and hadn't really thought about the impact on other marginalized people. But thank goodness we don't only get our books from libraries, right? We can get them from friends. We can buy them at bookstores. You know, I think that's what we have to do. I mean, we can't necessarily rely on organizations that might be bound to political machines to get all of our information. Sometimes we just have to seek it out. But yeah, I definitely think there are places where it won't be in the library.
It's so unfortunate because there'd be so much more of this.
Absolutely. All right. Yes, yeah.
Great. I wanted to know, during your research, did you all discover any information about Andre Caillou?
We did, and Andre Caillou is in our book.
Oh, wonderful. Would you share a little bit?
Absolutely. It's like you've read it. So Andre Caillou was a prominent free man of color, which there are so many people that live outside Louisiana, they don't even recognize that there were free people of color during that time. So that community is certainly highlighted in the book. And he was one of the really prominent officers in what originally was called the Corps d'Afrique and then later became Louisiana Native Guards, which were Black soldiers that fought during the Civil War on behalf of the Union Army. He was one of the main officers at Port Hudson. So he, those hundreds of soldiers that were led into that blind alley by Union officers and allowed to be massacred, he led that charge. And as I mentioned, hundreds of their bodies, they laid there for weeks, because they basically already almost sacrificed all of the Black soldiers. They certainly weren't going to sacrifice white soldiers to go in there to drag the Black bodies out. So they basically waited for the Confederate Army to be starved out. And then they sent the remaining Black soldiers in there to bury the rotting bodies of their compatriots. Andre Caillou had fallen on that field. And by the time they got to his body, he was so disintegrated, he was so decomposed that they only found him basically from a ring on his finger. And this was a great, great man that had fought hard to integrate the Union Army. He had fought hard to ensure that Black men were allowed to actually fight for their freedom, not just basically be enforced labor for the Union Army. And he died, while a very brave death, a very unceremonious death. And so he is certainly highlighted in our book.
He's
Yeah.
buried at St. Rose Lima.
Yeah. Well, with that, I do. Oh, yes.
I just wanted to ask, if you could share, one thing that was most rewarding about this writing experience for you, and what might have been most challenging, for your first time.
Those are great questions as well. What was most rewarding for me was to take aspects of her family history, my family history. You see quilts over there because quilts play a role in the book, and these are family quilts, right? This quilt on the end is a quilt that my grandmother and my great grandmother made together, and these are the types of things that my mother saves and talks to us about, like repurposing of cloth and how they would stitch together what they had, and to be able to highlight some of that in this book, and all the names of the Black family, those are our family names. To be able to make that come alive on paper and be inspired by my family was amazing. I would say the most challenging aspect of writing this is because you want to shine a light on history, but you don't want to do it in a way that's didactic or makes people run away from it. You want to talk about the hard issues, but we know right now people can be so defensive whenever you want to really talk about history. So, how do you do it in a way that is entertaining enough, impactful enough, emotional enough that they get so swept up in the story that they'll still continue to read and be educated? But some of the best reviews that we've had are people who say, I never knew any of this existed. It was really hard to read. I even cried a couple of times, but I laughed a couple of times. And at the end of the day, I learned so much. So I think that was probably the most challenging. But in a way, I guess that's the most rewarding too. So maybe before we turn off, I'll invite my mom, the original Stella, up here. And maybe my mom can just tell you a little bit. Maybe she'll tell you a little bit about the quilts. Maybe she'll tell you a little bit about the gallery. But certainly she's an inspiration to me on every page. So.
Amen.
Yeah.
That's my God moment.
Well, I'll just first like to thank all of you for coming out on a rainy and then not rainy. What is the day? Friday?
It's a Friday.
On a Friday evening. I know there are a lot of other things that you could have done, but you came in to join my family, and I want to thank you. And you all even get a chance to meet the new addition to our family.
Mm-hmm.
That's another little Harry back there. You all have any questions for me?
Well, maybe Mom, since these are, tell us how you feel about seeing the quilts and what they meant to you when you were coming up.
Well, I guess we really have to learn what is important for us. African Americans didn't have too much to start with unless you were the other African American. I had 6 sisters and brothers. My mom and dad my mom finished the 3rd grade, my dad finished the 8th grade, and they taught us almost everything we knew. My dad was a brilliant mathematician, but he could have never gone anywhere because he was always called boy or the N-word. But look at me.
Come on now.
And
Come on now.
my kids, look at Shauna.
Amen.
She's had
Oh, Mama,
diversity.
Our God, brother.
And I have 2 other daughters who are doing very well. And every opportunity that I get, I just have to sing praises for this gallery, because when we first opened, we were told that it would not last. And this is our 27th year.
Amen.
And thanks to all the community support.
Yes.
And if you have questions, I'll answer them for you, but I'm sort of a rambler. I can't keep on the subject.
No,
Like
that's
Michelle.
okay. But I do want to acknowledge that it takes people like Miss Vera and my mom to say that they want to stay in the community and that they have a mission that is focused on Black people, even when it may not always be the most economically viable thing. Even when I'm sure in this building it may not be the most comfortable thing for them, but they say, I won't deviate from my mission in spite of the fact that it may get hard at times. But when you think about the decades of success, Community Book Center going into its 39th year, Stella Jones Gallery going into its 26th year, it does tell you that people want to hear our stories.
Yes.
They want to see our images, and it may be difficult at times. They want to hear our music, but we just have to push forward. There is a market out there for us. Sometimes we might have to make it. Sometimes we might have to dig a little bit harder, but we shouldn't be dissuaded from it. So with that, maybe we'll say, yeah.
Thank you so much.